Opening. Let yourself settle in. Find that comfortable position where your body can truly rest. Take a slow breath, and as you exhale, allow the tension of the day to drift away like smoke, dispersing in a gentle breeze. Tonight, we're going to travel together through deep time, back to a moment when our ancestors stood at the very precipice of extinction, when the entire human story nearly ended before it truly began. This is a tale written not in ancient texts or carved stones, but in the very fabric of your DNA, a message from ancestors who survived against impossible odds. So close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the story unfold in the darkness behind your eyelids, where the past and present meet in the quiet theater of your imagination. The Discovery. Reading our genetic past. The story begins not in some dusty excavation site or remote cave, but in laboratories scattered across the globe, where scientists peer into the microscopic world of human DNA with tools that would seem like magic to our ancient forebears. In 2023, a team of researchers published findings in the journal Science that sent ripples through the scientific community, revealing something so profound, so unexpected, that it fundamentally altered our understanding of human origins. The research team, led by Dr. Yi-Xuan Pan from East China Normal University, analyzed genetic sequences from more than 3,000 individuals from diverse populations spanning the globe. But they weren't looking at ancient DNA extracted from fossilized bones. That technology, remarkable as it is, can only reach back about 400,000 years in most cases, and in the warm climates of Africa, where humanity first emerged, ancient genetic material degrades far too quickly to preserve. Instead, these scientists developed something entirely new, a computational method they called FitCoal, which stands for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process. The name might sound like something from a physics laboratory, but what it represents is nothing short of revolutionary. FitCoal allows researchers to read the genetic variations in people living today and work backwards through time, reconstructing the population sizes of our ancestors at specific points in the distant past. Think of your genome as a historical archive, a library containing millions of tiny variations that accumulated over countless generations. Each variation, each difference in the genetic code, tells a story about when it arose and how it spread through human populations. Some variations are common, shared by billions of people. Others are rare, found only in specific communities or regions. The distribution of these variations, what scientists call the site frequency spectrum, holds the key to understanding population dynamics across vast stretches of time. The researchers analyzed these patterns with extraordinary precision, examining not just a handful of genetic markers, but the entire genomic landscape of their subjects. They studied individuals from 10 African populations and 40 non-African populations, creating the most comprehensive picture yet of human genetic diversity. The data they gathered was staggering in its complexity, representing billions of data points that needed to be sifted, sorted, and interpreted. And then, in the vast sea of genetic information, they found something extraordinary. The data revealed a signature, a pattern that could only mean one thing. Sometime in the deep past, the human population had plummeted catastrophically. Not gradually, not over millions of years, but relatively suddenly in evolutionary terms. The numbers were shocking, almost unbelievable. Between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the breeding population of our human ancestors crashed to approximately 1,280 individuals. To put that in perspective, there are currently more than 8 billion people alive on Earth today. Even the most isolated communities number in the thousands or tens of thousands. But our ancestors, during this critical period, were reduced to a number so small that everyone alive could have fit into a mid-sized modern concert venue. But the truly staggering part wasn't just the number, it was the duration. This wasn't a brief crisis, a bad decade, or even a bad century. The bottleneck lasted for approximately 117,000 years. Think about that for a moment. 117,000 years. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present day, covers less than 10,000 years. Our ancestors survived in this precarious state for more than 11 times longer than all of human civilization. Dr. Yun-Shin Fu, a theoretical population geneticist who worked on the study, emphasized the significance of this discovery. The fact that Fit-Cole could detect such an ancient and severe bottleneck, even with relatively few genetic sequences compared to the vast human population, represented a genuine breakthrough in the field. The method had proven itself capable of peering further back into our past than almost anyone had thought possible. But detecting the bottleneck was only the beginning. The real questions were far more profound and mysterious. Where did these individuals live during this prolonged period of vulnerability? How did they overcome the catastrophic climate changes that were unfolding around them? Did natural selection during this bottleneck accelerate certain aspects of human evolution, particularly brain development? These questions opened entirely new avenues of inquiry into human origins. The implications were staggering. An estimated 66% of genetic diversity may have been lost during this ancient bottleneck. Nearly two-thirds of the genetic variation that had accumulated in human ancestors over millions of years simply vanished, pruned away by the brutal selective pressures of a world grown suddenly hostile. The genetic legacy of countless lineages, adaptations, and variations was erased, leaving only the descendants of those 1,280 breeding individuals to carry humanity forward. And this wasn't just some academic curiosity, some dry statistical finding buried in a scientific journal. This discovery meant that every single person alive today, from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the tundra of Siberia, from the deserts of Australia to the rainforests of the Amazon, descends from this tiny group of survivors. Your ancestors, and mine, and everyone you've ever known, all trace their lineage back through this narrow genetic bottleneck, this moment when humanity teetered on the very edge of extinction. The bottleneck. When humanity nearly vanished. To truly grasp the magnitude of what happened during this period, we need to understand what the population dynamics actually meant for our ancestors. A breeding population of 1,280 individuals doesn't mean that's all the humans who existed. Population geneticists use the term effective population size to describe the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation. The total population could have been larger, perhaps several times larger, but when you account for children, elderly individuals past reproductive age, and various other factors, only about 1,280 were successfully having offspring that themselves survived to reproduce. Even accounting for this, the numbers paint a picture of a species hanging by a thread. According to the research, approximately 98.7% of human ancestors were lost during this period. Nearly every human alive at the beginning of the bottleneck left no descendants. Entire lineages, entire populations simply vanished from the genetic record. It's as if someone had taken the human family tree and pruned away all but the thinnest, most precarious branch. The timeline itself tells a story of dramatic change. The bottleneck began around 930,000 years ago. This places it firmly in what geologists call the early to middle Pleistocene transition, a period of profound environmental upheaval. The Earth's climate was shifting in fundamental ways, and human populations, still relatively small and restricted primarily to Africa, found themselves caught in the grinding gears of planetary change. For 117,000 years, this bottleneck persisted. To give you a sense of that time frame, imagine that you could go back and visit your ancestors during this period. If you stayed long enough to witness the entire bottleneck from beginning to end, you would observe approximately 4,700 generations passing by. 4,700 cycles of birth, life, reproduction, and death, each one playing out in a world grown harsh and unforgiving, each generation managing to survive just long enough to pass the torch to the next. The geographic scope of the bottleneck remains somewhat mysterious. Dr. Giorgio Manzi, an anthropologist at Sapienza University of Rome, who worked on the study, noted that the bottleneck provides an explanation for the puzzling gap in the African and Eurasian fossil record during this period. Between roughly 900,000 and 650,000 years ago, the fossil evidence for human presence becomes remarkably sparse. Paleontologists had long noticed this chronological gap, this mysterious absence of human remains from a time when our ancestors should have been spreading and diversifying. Now, with the genetic evidence, the reason for this gap becomes clearer. If there were only around 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across what was likely a limited geographic range, the chances of any of them dying in circumstances that would lead to fossilization were vanishingly small. Fossilization is rare even in the best circumstances, requiring a specific combination of rapid burial, appropriate chemical conditions, and millions of years of geological stability. When the population itself is tiny, spread thin across a harsh landscape, the probability of leaving behind fossils drops to almost nothing. But while the fossil record falls silent during this period, the genetic record speaks volumes. The bottleneck left an indelible signature in our DNA, a scar that every human carries to this day. When populations crash to such small numbers, certain genetic patterns emerge. Rare variations are lost entirely. Common variations become even more common. The overall genetic diversity decreases dramatically, and specific lineages come to dominate the gene pool simply because they happen to survive when so many others did not. The researchers found that this severe bottleneck occurred roughly between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, profoundly influencing the genetic makeup of today's humans. Every quirk of human genetics, every disease susceptibility, every beneficial adaptation that distinguishes us from other great apes was filtered through this narrow bottleneck. The humans who emerged on the other side were fundamentally different from those who entered it, not because they had evolved dramatically, but because so much genetic variation had simply been lost. The mathematics of population genetics tells us something important about small populations. Below a certain threshold known as the minimum viable population, a species becomes vulnerable to what biologists call an extinction vortex. Random events, chance variations in birth rates and death rates, can cause the population to spiral downward toward zero. Genetic diversity drops so low that inbreeding becomes inevitable, potentially bringing harmful recessive traits to the surface. Disease can sweep through the entire population with devastating efficiency when everyone is closely related. 1,280 breeding individuals sits right at the edge of this dangerous territory. Some population biologists would argue it's below the minimum viable population for a species as complex as humans. Yet, somehow, impossibly, our ancestors persisted. For 117,000 years, they managed to avoid the extinction vortex. Generation after generation, they found enough food, enough water, enough shelter. They managed to raise children in conditions that must have been almost unimaginably difficult. They survived, but survival came at a cost. The genetic diversity during this time shrank by around 66%. 2/3 of the genetic variation that had been present in the population before the bottleneck simply vanished. Alleles that might have conferred resistance to certain diseases were lost. Variations that might have allowed adaptation to different environments disappeared. The genetic toolkit that evolution had been accumulating for millions of years was drastically reduced. Yet in this reduction, in this genetic pruning, something remarkable may have happened. When populations crash and then recover, evolution can act with unusual speed. The survivors of a bottleneck aren't a random sample of the original population. They're the individuals whose traits, through some combination of genetics and luck, allowed them to persevere when others could not. And if those traits are heritable, if they're encoded in genes that can be passed to offspring, then the recovering population will be enriched for whatever characteristics enabled that survival. This is where the story becomes not just about loss, but about transformation. The humans who survived the bottleneck carried with them specific genetic variants, specific combinations of genes that proved themselves under the most extreme selective pressures imaginable. Whatever abilities allowed our ancestors to endure 117,000 years of environmental hardship became more common, more concentrated in the gene pool as the population slowly, painstakingly clawed its way back from the brink. During this bottleneck, natural selection likely played a critical role, pushing humans to develop traits suited to extreme survival conditions. The researchers speculate that this period may have accelerated certain aspects of human evolution, particularly those related to brain development and cognitive abilities. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just lucky survivors. They were quite possibly different in fundamental ways from the humans who had entered it. The climate catastrophe, ice ages, and arid lands. To understand why the population crashed so dramatically, we need to examine what was happening to the Earth itself during this period. The planet has never been a stable, unchanging home for humanity. Climate shifts and drifts across vast geological timescales, sometimes gradually, sometimes with shocking rapidity. And around 930,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of particularly dramatic change. Geologists call this the mid-Pleistocene transition, or MPT, a term that sounds almost mundane but describes a fundamental reorganization of Earth's climate system. For millions of years before this transition, the planet had experienced glacial cycles, periods when ice sheets advanced from the poles toward lower latitudes, alternating with warmer interglacial periods. But these cycles followed a relatively regular pattern, driven primarily by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, with a periodicity of about 40,000 years. Then, around 900,000 years ago, something changed. The mid-Pleistocene transition marked a shift from 40,000-year glacial cycles to 100,000-year cycles. More importantly, the glaciations themselves became longer, more intense, and more severe. The cold periods grew colder, the ice sheets grew thicker and pushed further toward the equator. And the warm, interglacial periods, those brief reprieves from the ice, became proportionally shorter. The research suggests that the bottleneck occurred at the time of marine isotope stage 22, around 900,000 years ago, which marked the first major ice age of the Pleistocene. This wasn't just another cold period. It was a glaciation unlike anything the planet had experienced in the previous several 100,000 years. Ice sheets expanded dramatically in the northern hemisphere, locking up vast quantities of water and causing sea levels to drop by more than 100 meters in some estimates. But it wasn't just the cold that threatened human populations. The effects cascaded through every ecosystem on Earth. Ocean circulation patterns shifted, storm tracks changed, and critically for human ancestors living in Africa, the climate became not just colder, but drastically drier. This bottleneck appears to have coincided with glaciation events that led to changes in temperatures, severe droughts, and extinctions of other species, potentially including animals that ancient humans relied upon for food. The African landscape transformed. Grasslands that had supported herds of game animals withered and shrank. Water sources dried up. The forests that provided fruits, nuts, and other plant foods retreated or disappeared entirely in some regions. Imagine the experience of living through such changes. For our ancestors, who lacked any understanding of climate science or glacial cycles, the world would have simply seemed to be dying. Year after year, the rains would fail to come as expected. Year after year, the herds would be smaller, the vegetation sparser. Rivers that had flowed reliably for countless generations would slow to trickles, then dry completely, leaving behind only cracked mud and the bones of animals that had come desperately searching for water that no longer existed. In Africa, this period led to long periods of drought. The continent, which had been the cradle of human evolution, became increasingly inhospitable. Populations that had spread across diverse habitats found their ranges shrinking, fragmented by expanding deserts and dying ecosystems. Groups that had once been numerous enough to sustain themselves became isolated, cut off from other human populations by impassable barriers of waterless wasteland. The temperature changes were severe. While exact figures are difficult to pin down for specific locations, climate reconstructions suggest that global temperatures dropped by several degrees Celsius. In tropical and subtropical regions like Africa, where human ancestors lived, even a few degrees of cooling could have dramatic effects on rainfall patterns, vegetation zones, and the distribution of animals. But the cold itself wasn't the primary killer for African populations. Unlike the humans who would later adapt to Ice Age Europe, equipped with sophisticated clothing, controlled fire, and complex shelter construction, our ancestors 900,000 years ago had far more limited technological abilities. They were likely still dependent on relatively warm climates, still tied to regions where they could find food year-round, without the need for complex cold weather adaptations. The drying of Africa presented multiple compounding challenges. First, water itself became scarce. Humans need to drink regularly, and in hot climates, the water requirements are even higher. As rivers and lakes dried up, populations would have been forced to cluster around the remaining water sources. This concentration would have intensified competition for food resources in the immediate vicinity, potentially leading to conflict between groups. Second, the plants and animals that humans depended on for food were themselves stressed by the changing climate. Many species didn't survive. The period saw extinctions of other species, potentially including key prey animals. Each extinction removed one more potential food source from the environment, making survival that much harder for the humans trying to persist in these increasingly barren landscapes. Third, the fragmentation of habitats meant that human populations became isolated from one another. In good times, when resources are abundant and the landscape is productive, human groups can maintain contact even when separated by considerable distances. Trade networks form, information spreads, genetic exchange occurs. But when resources become scarce and travel becomes dangerous, these connections break down. Populations become islands unto themselves, cut off from the genetic diversity and cultural exchange that might have helped them adapt to changing conditions. The fossil evidence, sparse as it is for this period, hints at the scope of these changes. Pollen analysis from sediment cores shows dramatic shifts in vegetation. Forests gave way to grasslands. Grasslands gave way to scrubland. Scrubland gave way to desert. Animal fossils show species distributions changing, with cold-adapted species moving southward and heat-loving species retreating toward the equator. The research team concluded that the bottleneck coincided with a major diaspora from Africa into Eurasia, occurring when hominins came close to extinction. This suggests that some human populations may have responded to the African climate crisis by attempting to migrate out of the continent entirely, pushing northward into regions that, while still hostile, might have offered new opportunities for survival. The connection between the climate catastrophe and the population bottleneck isn't just correlation. The timing aligns too precisely, and the mechanisms make too much sense. When the environment becomes hostile enough, when food and water become scarce enough, populations crash. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout the history of life on Earth. Species that cannot adapt, cannot migrate to more hospitable regions, or cannot persist through sheer resilience simply vanish. Our ancestors came terrifyingly close to joining that long list of extinct species. For 117,000 years, as the climate remained hostile, as the droughts persisted, they held on by their fingernails to existence itself. Every generation that survived was a small miracle. Every child born and raised to adulthood represented a victory against overwhelming odds. And somehow, impossibly, that fragile thread of survival never quite broke. The survivors. How they endured. The question that haunts researchers is perhaps the simplest to ask and the hardest to answer. How did they do it? How did a population of roughly 1,280 breeding individuals persist for 117,000 years in the face of environmental conditions that pushed countless other species to extinction? Nick Ashton, a Paleolithic archaeologist at the British Museum, noted that for such a small population to survive for so long, it would have required a very localized area with good social cohesion and a stable environment with sufficient resources and few stresses to the system. This observation cuts to the heart of the mystery. The humans who survived the bottleneck couldn't have been scattered thinly across a vast landscape. They must have found refugia, pockets of relative stability where the environmental catastrophe wasn't quite as severe. Where might these refugia have been? The genetic evidence doesn't tell us directly. The population could have been concentrated in East Africa, where the Great Rift Valley creates diverse microclimates, and where some water sources might have persisted even during the worst of the drought. Or they might have clustered in South Africa, where the interaction between Atlantic and Indian Ocean weather systems can create local areas of higher rainfall. Some researchers have even suggested that populations might have survived in the highlands of Ethiopia, where elevation provided some buffering against the drying of the lowlands. But location alone wasn't enough. Survival required specific capabilities, specific technologies and behaviors that could bridge the gap between the resources the environment provided and the resources humans needed to live. Fire would have been absolutely critical. The control of fire, a vital skill for warmth and cooking, probably played a key role in their survival. The ability to create and maintain fire on demand rather than relying on natural fires started by lightning would have provided multiple advantages. Fire offered protection from predators at night. It allowed humans to cook food, making tough plant materials more digestible and killing parasites and pathogens in meat. It provided warmth during the cooler periods, and it could be used to drive game during hunts, making the capture of prey animals more efficient. The evidence for controlled use of fire by human ancestors extends back quite far in the archaeological record. While definitive proof of fire-making, as opposed to fire-keeping, is harder to establish, it seems likely that by 900,000 years ago, human populations had mastered at least the basics of fire technology. This one innovation would have dramatically expanded the range of environments humans could occupy and the resources they could exploit. Tool technology would have been equally important. The making and use of stone tools, a practice stretching back millions of years in the human lineage, would have been essential for processing food, working hides, constructing shelters, and defending against predators. The specific tool technologies in use 900,000 years ago were likely fairly simple by later standards. But even basic stone choppers and scrapers would have made the difference between barely surviving and not surviving at all. But technology alone doesn't explain how such a small population persisted for so long. Numbers matter in survival. A population of 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across even a relatively small area would have had difficulty maintaining cohesion. Individuals might go days or weeks without encountering another human. Mating opportunities would have been limited. The chances of finding a mate at all, let alone one healthy enough to successfully reproduce, would have been a constant concern. This suggests that the survivors weren't scattered. They were grouped together, probably in relatively tight-knit communities. Social organization became survival. The ability to cooperate, to share resources, to care for the sick and injured, to pass knowledge from generation to generation, all these social capabilities would have been tested and refined during the bottleneck. Language, or at least some form of complex communication, almost certainly played a role. Humans needed to coordinate their activities, to share information about where food and water could be found, to plan collective hunts or the gathering of plant resources. The sophistication of language among human ancestors 900,000 years ago remains a subject of debate, but some form of symbolic communication seems necessary to explain how such small groups managed such remarkable persistence. Consider the demographic challenges. In a population of 1,280 breeding individuals, every death mattered. Every failed pregnancy, every child who didn't survive to adulthood, every hunter who was injured or killed during a hunt, each represented a tiny but significant reduction in the gene pool. The population was small enough that random variations in birth and death rates could have sent it spiraling into extinction. Yet, somehow, the spiral never quite occurred. Generation after generation, enough children were born and survived to reproductive age. Enough adults remained healthy and capable enough to hunt, gather, and care for the young. The population fluctuated, certainly. It may have dropped even lower at times, perhaps to a few hundred individuals. It may have risen somewhat during better years. But the thread of survival, however thin, held. Adaptation played a role as well, though not in the dramatic sense of major evolutionary transformations. Over 117,000 years, natural selection had ample time to act. Individuals with traits that conferred even a slight survival advantage in the harsh conditions would have been more likely to pass those traits to the next generation. The recovering population would gradually become enriched for whatever genetic variants helped with drought resistance, disease resistance, efficient metabolism, or any of 100 other factors that mattered in a marginal environment. Some of these adaptations might have been physiological. Perhaps improved water conservation, or a more efficient digestive system, or enhanced immune responses to the diseases that would have been common in stressed, malnourished populations. Other adaptations might have been behavioral or cognitive. Enhanced problem-solving abilities, better memory for the locations of seasonal water sources, improved social intelligence that facilitated cooperation within groups. The researchers speculate that several factors contributed to their survival, including the control of fire and probably other technological innovations. But beyond specific technologies, the survivors must have possessed what we might call flexibility, the ability to adapt their strategies and behaviors to changing circumstances. When one food source disappeared, they found alternatives. When one water source dried up, they moved to another. When traditional hunting grounds became barren, they explored new territories. This flexibility, this behavioral plasticity, may have been one of the most important factors enabling survival. Species that become too specialized, too dependent on specific environmental conditions or specific resources, are vulnerable when those conditions change. But species that can adapt, that can shift their behavior and diet in response to environmental pressures, have a much better chance of persisting through hard times. Our ancestors, it seems, were flexible enough, adaptive enough, resilient enough. They weren't specialized for any particular environment or any particular food source. They were generalists, capable of eating a wide variety of foods, living in a range of different habitats, and adjusting their behaviors to match the demands of their circumstances. This generalist strategy, while perhaps preventing them from becoming highly efficient at exploiting any one particular niche, gave them the versatility to survive when more specialized species could not. And survive they did for 117,000 years through a climate catastrophe that reshaped continents and drove countless species extinct. They held on, that tiny population of survivors, through thousands of generations of hardship. They raised children who survived to raise children of their own. They passed knowledge and skills from parent to child, from elder to youth. They maintained their social bonds, their communities, their humanity, even as the world around them seemed bent on their destruction. Until finally, around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The climate began to shift again. The long glaciations started to ease. Rainfall patterns became slightly more reliable, temperatures moderated, at least somewhat, resources became more abundant, and the human population, pressed into a tiny corner of existence for so long, began to expand once more. The genetic legacy. Chromosome 2. Fusion. Hidden within the story of the bottleneck is another mystery, one that connects directly to what makes us distinctly human. All of our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, have 24 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 48. But humans have only 23 pairs, totaling 46. We're missing a pair of chromosomes compared to our evolutionary cousins. Except we're not really missing them. Something fascinating happened in our lineage, something that may be intimately connected to the bottleneck event. Human chromosome 2 is a result of an end-to-end fusion of two ancestral chromosomes. At some point in the past, two separate chromosomes that existed in our ancestors merged together, fusing at their ends to create a single, larger chromosome. The evidence for this fusion is written clearly in our DNA for anyone with the tools to read it. First, there's the correspondence with ape chromosomes. When scientists compare human chromosome 2 with chimpanzee chromosomes, they find that the genes on human chromosome 2 match in perfect order. The genes on two separate chimpanzee chromosomes called 2A and 2B. It's as if someone took those two chimpanzee chromosomes and attached them end to end. The gene sequence flows continuously from what would be the end of one chromosome to what would be the beginning of another, without any break in the pattern. Second, there are telomeres in the wrong place. Telomeres are special DNA sequences that cap the ends of chromosomes, protecting them from degradation and preventing them from fusing with other chromosomes. They're like the plastic tips on shoelaces, serving to keep the ends intact. Normally, you find telomeres only at the ends of chromosomes, but human chromosome 2 has telomere sequences right in the middle, exactly where you would expect to find them if two chromosomes had fused end to end. Third, there's a vestigial centromere. The centromere is the point where the cellular machinery attaches to a chromosome during cell division, allowing it to be pulled apart and distributed to daughter cells. Every chromosome has one active centromere. But human chromosome 2 has remnants of a second centromere, right where you would expect to find it if this chromosome used to be two separate chromosomes, each with its own centromere. This second centromere is no longer functional, but its genetic signature remains, a molecular fossil of our evolutionary past. The fusion event that created human chromosome 2 happened somewhere along the human lineage after we diverged from chimpanzees. But exactly when? Research suggests that the fusion occurred somewhere between about 740,000 years ago and as far back as 2.8 million years ago, with more recent estimates placing it closer to around 900,000 years ago. Do you see the timing? 900,000 years ago, right at the beginning of the bottleneck period. The coincidence is striking, perhaps too striking to be mere chance. Some researchers have suggested that the chromosome 2 fusion may have been responsible for triggering speciation, potentially as a result of changes in human genetics. Chromosome rearrangements can affect fertility between populations. If one group has the fused chromosome and another group has the ancestral 2 chromosome configuration, matings between them might produce offspring with reduced fertility or other reproductive disadvantages. Here's where the story becomes even more intriguing. The fusion had to start somewhere. Some individual, at some point in the past, was born with this chromosomal rearrangement. Perhaps it occurred during the formation of an egg or sperm cell, when an error in chromosome handling caused 2 chromosomes to fuse together. That individual would have had 46 chromosomes instead of the usual 48. Now, you might think such a change would be catastrophic, that such an individual would be unable to survive or reproduce. But chromosome fusions don't necessarily prevent survival. The genes themselves remain intact, just rearranged. The real challenge comes in reproduction. When an individual with the fused chromosome attempts to reproduce with an individual who has the 2 separate chromosomes, problems can arise during meiosis, the special type of cell division that creates egg and sperm cells. The chromosomes need to pair up properly, but when one parent has 2 separate chromosomes and the other has those same genes on a single fused chromosome, the pairing process becomes complicated. This can lead to reproductive problems, reduced fertility, or offspring with chromosomal abnormalities. In most cases, such a chromosomal rearrangement would simply disappear. The individual carrying it might have difficulty finding mates willing to reproduce with them, or their offspring might have lower survival rates. The mutation would be selected against, removed from the population by the relentless grinding of natural selection. But something different happened with the chromosome 2 fusion. It didn't disappear. Instead, it spread. Eventually, it became fixed in the human lineage, meaning that every human alive today carries this fused chromosome. How did this happen? This is where the bottleneck enters the picture. In a large, widespread population, a chromosomal rearrangement like this would face enormous barriers to spreading. Most individuals carrying it would be at a reproductive disadvantage, and the mutation would remain rare or disappear entirely. But in a very small population, especially one that's geographically isolated, the dynamics change dramatically. If the chromosome fusion occurred in an individual who happened to be part of that tiny bottleneck population of 1,280, the odds of it spreading increase dramatically. With so few individuals in the breeding population, even neutral or slightly disadvantageous traits can become common through a process called genetic drift. Random variations in who survives to reproduce, who has more children, who happens to pass their genes to the next generation, all these chance events have much larger effects in small populations. And if the bottleneck population was isolated, geographically separated from other human groups, then the individuals carrying the fusion would have been breeding primarily with each other. Over time, the proportion of individuals carrying the fused chromosome would increase. Eventually, it might become so common that finding a mate without the fusion would be rare or impossible. The researchers suggest that the chromosome 2 fusion may have been responsible for triggering speciation, the process by which one species splits into two or more distinct species. If some populations had the fusion and others didn't, reproductive barriers would exist between them. Matings between the two groups might produce offspring with reduced fertility, creating a genetic divide that would become more pronounced over time. This raises a fascinating possibility. The humans who survived the bottleneck, the ancestors of all modern humans, might have been genetically incompatible with other human populations that existed before or during the bottleneck. The chromosome fusion, occurring at roughly the same time as the population crash, might have been part of what made them a distinct species. This would help explain something that has puzzled paleoanthropologists for years. The fossil record shows multiple hominin species existing in Africa during the Middle Pleistocene. There were Homo heidelbergensis, possible ancestors to both Neanderthals and modern humans. There were other, less well-defined species that show characteristics intermediate between earlier hominins and later ones. But modern humans, Homo sapiens, seem to appear relatively suddenly in the fossil record, with a distinct suite of characteristics that set us apart from these earlier forms. If the chromosome fusion occurred during the bottleneck, it might help explain this apparent sudden appearance. The survivors of the bottleneck weren't just a small population. They were a population that had become reproductively isolated from other hominins through a chromosomal change. They were effectively a new species. This speciation event would have profound implications for human evolution. It means that the genetic diversity we see in modern humans doesn't extend back continuously through millions of years of evolution. Instead, it traces back to that bottleneck, to that moment when our lineage became distinct. Everything that happened before the bottleneck, all the genetic variation that had accumulated over millions of years in earlier hominin populations, was either lost entirely or filtered through this narrow passage of chromosome-fused survivors. The loss of genetic diversity during the bottleneck would have been compounded by the speciation event. Not only did 98.7% of human ancestors disappear during the population crash, but any genetic variation that existed in populations that didn't carry the chromosome fusion would have been eliminated from our lineage entirely. We didn't just lose most of our ancestors. We lost entire branches of the human family tree. Yet this loss, as devastating as it was, also created something new. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just lucky survivors. They were a distinct species, shaped by the extreme selective pressures of the bottleneck and marked by a unique chromosomal signature. They carried within their DNA the legacy of survival, the traits and genes that had proven themselves under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The recovery. Population expansion. The bottleneck didn't last forever. Around 813,000 years ago, approximately 117,000 years after it began, the human population started to recover. The genetic data shows this clearly in the patterns of variation that exist in modern human DNA. The site-frequency spectrum begins to shift, indicating that the effective population size was increasing. What changed? Most likely the climate. The mid-Pleistocene transition that had triggered the crisis began to ease. The glaciation that had locked up so much water in ice sheets and disrupted global climate patterns started to wane. Temperatures moderated slightly. Rainfall patterns became more reliable. The extreme droughts that had turned much of Africa into uninhabitable wasteland began to lift. It wouldn't have been a sudden transformation. The climate didn't flip from catastrophic to benign overnight. Instead, gradual changes accumulated over centuries and millennia. Dry lake beds began to hold water again during the rainy seasons. Rivers that had dwindled to seasonal trickles started flowing year-round. Vegetation zones that had retreated expanded once more, creeping back into regions where they had disappeared. For the surviving human populations, these changes would have been profound. More water meant more opportunities for survival. More vegetation meant more plant foods and more habitat for the animals that humans hunted. More resources meant that populations could grow, that more children could be raised to adulthood, that groups could split and form new communities without dropping below the critical threshold of viability. The population expansion wasn't rapid by modern standards. We're not talking about the explosive population growth that would characterize later human history. The growth was gradual, probably measured in fractions of a % per generation. But compounded over thousands of years, even slow growth rates can produce dramatic results. From that bottleneck population of around 1,280 breeding individuals, the human lineage began to diversify once again. Groups spread across different regions of Africa, adapting to local conditions. Some remained in the areas where their ancestors had survived the bottleneck. Others ventured into new territories, following the expansion of habitable environments as the climate continued to improve. The genetic legacy of this recovery is written in the patterns of human diversity today. All modern human populations trace their ancestry back through this bottleneck. The variations we see in skin color, in facial features, in susceptibility to different diseases, in countless other traits, all arose after the bottleneck as human populations expanded and adapted to different environments. But the expansion wasn't limited to Africa. The improving climate that allowed human populations to recover within Africa also opened corridors for migration out of the continent. Between 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, multiple hominin groups migrated into Eurasia. These weren't necessarily the direct ancestors of modern humans, the specific lineage that had survived the bottleneck with the chromosome 2 fusion. Instead, they were probably related species, populations that had diverged from the main human lineage at various points in the past. These migrants into Eurasia would go on to evolve into several distinct species. One lineage would eventually become the Neanderthals, adapting to the cold climates of Ice Age Europe with their stocky builds, large noses for warming cold air, and sophisticated hunting cultures. Another lineage would become the Denisovans, known primarily from genetic evidence and a handful of fossil remains found in Siberia. Still other lineages probably existed, though we have yet to discover clear evidence of them in the fossil record. Meanwhile, in Africa, the ancestors of modern humans continued to evolve. The population that had survived the bottleneck, now expanding and diversifying, was developing the characteristics that would eventually distinguish Homo sapiens from all other hominin species. Brain size continued to increase. Tool technologies became more sophisticated. Social organization grew more complex. Language abilities, already present in some form, became more refined. By about 300,000 years ago, fossils that are recognizably modern human appear in the African record. These are individuals who, if you saw them walking down the street today, wouldn't look dramatically out of place, though they would certainly show some differences from contemporary populations. They had the high, rounded skulls that characterize modern humans. They had the relatively flat faces. They had chin development, a uniquely human trait that other hominin species lacked. But these early Homo sapiens weren't quite like modern humans in all respects. Their brains, while within the modern human size range, had a slightly different shape. The back of the skull was more elongated. Certain aspects of their skeleton showed characteristics intermediate between earlier hominins and later humans. They were modern humans, but perhaps we might think of them as early modern humans, still carrying some legacy of their evolutionary past. Over the next several 100,000 years, human populations continued to evolve. The recovery from the bottleneck was complete. The human lineage had not just survived its brush with extinction, but had emerged to become one of the most widespread and adaptable species on Earth. Groups began migrating out of Africa in significant numbers, probably around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, spreading across Eurasia and eventually reaching every continent except Antarctica. These later migrations would carry humans into environments far more diverse than anything their African ancestors had experienced. From tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from high mountain plateaus to coastal plains, humans proved capable of adapting to almost any environment the planet could present. The flexibility, the behavioral plasticity that had allowed their ancestors to survive the bottleneck served them well as they colonized the globe. And everywhere they went, they encountered and sometimes interbred with other hominin species. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, perhaps other archaic humans whose remains we haven't yet discovered. The genetic legacy of these encounters remains in modern human DNA, with most non-African populations carrying small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry and some Asian and Oceanian populations carrying Denisovan ancestry as well. But despite these instances of interbreeding, the basic story remains clear. All modern humans, from every population across the globe, descend primarily from that group of African ancestors who survived the bottleneck. We carry their chromosomal fusion. We inherit their genetic legacy, pruned and shaped by 117,000 years of survival against impossible odds. The other bottleneck, Toba, and more recent events. The bottleneck at 930,000 years ago wasn't the only time human populations crashed to dangerously low levels. Our species has faced extinction multiple times, and each near miss left its mark on our genetic heritage. Perhaps the most famous of these later bottlenecks centers on an event that occurred approximately 74,000 years ago. On the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, a massive volcano called Toba erupted in what geologists classify as a supervolcanic eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. The eruption of Mount Toba was an event of almost incomprehensible scale. The volcano blasted approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. Volcanic ash from Toba spread across vast distances. It blanketed much of Southeast Asia in layers meters thick. It fell across the Indian subcontinent, covering parts of India in at least 10 centimeters of ash. Microscopic glass shards from the eruption, called cryptotephra, have been found as far away as eastern Africa, more than 5,000 miles from the volcano. These tiny pieces of glass, smaller than the diameter of a human hair, were carried around the world by atmospheric circulation patterns. But the ash fall, devastating as it must have been for any populations living in the immediate vicinity, wasn't the most dangerous aspect of the eruption. The real threat came from the massive quantities of sulfur dioxide that Toba injected into the stratosphere. Ice core records suggest the eruption released approximately 100 billion kilograms of sulfur into the upper atmosphere. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets reflect incoming sunlight, reducing the amount of solar radiation that reaches Earth's surface. The result is global cooling, a volcanic winter that can persist for years after an eruption. Some climate models suggest that Toba could have reduced global temperatures by 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius for several years, with some regions experiencing even more dramatic cooling. The Toba catastrophe theory, proposed in the early 1990s, suggested that this volcanic winter was so severe that it pushed human populations to the brink of extinction. The theory pointed to genetic evidence showing that modern human populations have surprisingly low genetic diversity, lower than would be expected for a species that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. This low diversity could be explained by a severe population bottleneck, and the timing seemed to match the Toba eruption. Early genetic studies suggested that the human effective population size had dropped to between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals around this time. Population genetics analysis of mitochondrial DNA showed evidence of a rapid expansion from a small population sometime between 35,000 and 65,000 years ago. The genetic pattern seemed to tell a story of near extinction followed by recovery. For years, the Toba catastrophe theory was widely discussed in both scientific and popular literature. It offered a compelling narrative, a single catastrophic event that nearly wiped out humanity, leaving only a small group of survivors to rebuild the species. The few thousand humans who persisted through the volcanic winter became the ancestors of all people alive today. It was a dramatic story, and it seemed to fit the genetic evidence. But as researchers gathered more data, the picture became more complicated. Archaeological evidence from sites in Africa and Asia began to challenge the idea that Toba was as catastrophic as the theory suggested. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, excavations revealed that humans not only survived the Toba eruption, but appeared to thrive in its aftermath. Stone tools found in layers dating to just after the eruption showed technical innovations that persisted for thousands of years. In Ethiopia, at a site called Shinfa Metema, one along the Shinfa River, researchers found clear evidence of human occupation before, during, and after the Toba eruption. The site contained more than 400,000 artifacts, including heat-treated stone tools, animal bones, and evidence of controlled fire use. Analysis of ostrich eggshells and fossilized mammal teeth from the site revealed what the climate was like during this period. The isotope data told a story not of catastrophic cooling, but of increasing aridity. The eruption didn't plunge the region into an ice age. Instead, it appears to have made conditions drier, extending the dry season and forcing humans to rely more heavily on fishing and on water sources along rivers. The humans at Shinfa Metema adapted to these changing conditions, maintaining their presence in the area for thousands of years. Similar findings came from India. At a site called Daba in northern India's Middle Sun Valley, researchers found an 80,000-year-long archaeological sequence that spanned the time of the Toba eruption. Stone tools from before and after Toba showed remarkable continuity. The toolkits didn't disappear or change dramatically. Humans in India, like those in Africa, persisted through the eruption. These archaeological findings forced a re-evaluation of the Toba catastrophe theory. While the eruption was undeniably massive, its effects on human populations appear to have been less severe than initially proposed. Most climatologists now suggest that the cooling was more muted than early models predicted. The volcanic winter might have lasted for years rather than decades, and the long-term climate effects were probably less dramatic than the theory suggested. But the genetic evidence for a bottleneck remains. Multiple studies have found signatures in human DNA indicating that population sizes dropped significantly sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. If Toba wasn't solely responsible, what caused this bottleneck? The answer appears to be more complex than a single catastrophic event. The period around 70,000 years ago was a time of significant climate change even without the volcano. The Earth was transitioning into a glacial phase, part of the 100,000-year climate cycles that had become established after the mid-Pleistocene transition. Ice sheets were expanding in the northern hemisphere, sea levels were dropping, climate zones were shifting. In Africa, this transition meant increasing aridity across much of the continent. Rainfall patterns became less reliable, Deserts expanded, forests shrank, the habitable zones for human populations contracted. This long-term climate deterioration combined with the additional stress of the Toba eruption may have been enough to cause a significant population decline. Different genetic studies have found evidence for bottlenecks at slightly different times. Some African populations show their lowest numbers around 70 to 80,000 years ago. Others reach their minimum around 50,000 years ago. This variation suggests that different populations experienced the crisis at different times or to different degrees. The genetic data from the Luhya and Maasai people of East Africa show their populations reaching a minimum around 70 to 80,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with Toba. But the Yoruba people of West Africa show their lowest numbers around 50,000 years ago, well after the eruption. These differences suggest that the bottleneck wasn't a single, synchronized event affecting all human populations equally. Instead, it may have been a period of general environmental stress that affected different groups at different times. Non-African populations show their own distinct bottleneck patterns. All modern humans outside Africa descend from a relatively small group that migrated out of the continent sometime between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago. This founding population may have numbered only a few thousand individuals, creating a bottleneck effect for all their descendants. The effective population size during this migration appears to have been smaller than the African populations from which they derived. So, while the Toba eruption probably didn't single-handedly bring humans to the brink of extinction, it occurred during a period when human populations were already under stress from climate change. The eruption would have added to these existing challenges, potentially pushing some populations over the edge while others adapted and survived. The behavioral flexibility that researchers have identified in populations that survived Toba mirrors what must have been necessary during the much earlier bottleneck at 930,000 years ago. Humans survived both crises not because they were physically adapted to specific environments, but because they could modify their behavior to match changing conditions. They could shift their diet when preferred foods became scarce. They could develop new technologies to exploit resources that had previously been inaccessible. They could move to new areas when their traditional territories became uninhabitable. This flexibility, this capacity for cultural and behavioral adaptation, became one of the defining characteristics of the human species. Other animals adapt to changing environments primarily through biological evolution, through changes in their genetic makeup that occur over many generations. Humans can adapt much more rapidly through cultural evolution, through the invention and transmission of new behaviors, technologies, and strategies. Fire technology, for example, could be developed and spread through a population within a single generation, conferring immediate survival advantages. The invention of cooking didn't require genetic changes. It simply required someone to discover the technique and others to learn it. Stone tool improvements could accumulate over generations, with each innovation building on the last, without requiring any changes to the human genome. This capacity for rapid cultural adaptation may be what ultimately allowed humans to survive multiple close calls with extinction. When the climate turned against us, when volcanic eruptions disrupted global weather patterns, when droughts turned fertile lands into deserts, humans could respond not just through the slow process of biological evolution, but through the much faster process of cultural innovation. The implications. What this tells us about ourselves. The story of these bottlenecks, particularly the severe ancient one at 930,000 years ago, reveals something profound about the human condition. We are, in a very real sense, a species that has survived against the odds, that has persisted through conditions that drove countless other species to extinction. Every human alive today carries within their cells the legacy of those ancient survivors. The chromosome 2 fusion serves as a permanent reminder, a molecular scar that marks our passage through that narrow genetic bottleneck. 2/3 of the genetic diversity that existed in our ancestors before the bottleneck was lost, pruned away by the harsh realities of survival in a world turned hostile. This loss of genetic diversity has had lasting consequences. Compared to many other species, humans are remarkably genetically uniform. Two humans chosen at random from anywhere on Earth are more genetically similar than two chimpanzees chosen from the same forest. This low genetic diversity is both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, low genetic diversity means that humans are fundamentally similar. The genetic differences between human populations are tiny compared to the similarities. All humans share the vast majority of their DNA. This genetic similarity underlies our shared humanity, our ability to communicate, cooperate, and recognize ourselves in each other regardless of geographic or cultural distances. On the other hand, low genetic diversity can make a species vulnerable. Genetic variation is the raw material for evolution. It's what allows populations to adapt to changing conditions, to develop resistance to new diseases, to explore new evolutionary possibilities. A species with high genetic diversity has more options, more potential ways to respond to environmental challenges. A species with low diversity has fewer options. The bottlenecks also provide insight into human brain evolution. Both the ancient bottleneck and the more recent Toba-era bottleneck occurred during periods when human brain size was increasing. The researchers studying the ancient bottleneck noted that natural selection during this period may have accelerated human evolution, particularly those traits related to brain development and cognitive abilities. Selection during bottlenecks can be particularly strong. When only a tiny fraction of the population survives, whatever traits those survivors possess become, by definition, the traits of the entire species going forward. If the survivors had enhanced cognitive abilities, better problem-solving skills, improved memory, or any other mental capabilities that helped them persist through the crisis, those capabilities would become enriched in the recovering population. This raises a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the qualities we think of as distinctly human, our exceptional intelligence, our capacity for complex language, our ability to plan for the future and learn from the past, were refined during these periods of extreme stress. The bottlenecks may have acted as crucibles, burning away genetic variation while concentrating the traits that made survival possible. Brain development requires enormous amounts of energy. The human brain, despite representing only about 2% of body weight, consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy budget. In times of resource scarcity, maintaining such an energy-expensive organ would seem like a liability. Yet humans not only maintained their large brains during the bottlenecks, but possibly continued to evolve toward even larger brains afterward. This suggests that the cognitive capabilities provided by large brains were essential for survival during these crises. Intelligence wasn't a luxury that could be sacrificed when times got tough. It was a necessity, perhaps the key adaptation that allowed humans to persist when less cognitively flexible species could not. The ability to remember where water could be found during droughts, to solve problems creatively, to cooperate in complex social groups, to develop and transmit technologies across generations, all these cognitive capabilities would have been tested and refined during the bottlenecks. The bottlenecks also tell us something about human vulnerability. For all our current dominance of the planet, for all our technology and our billions of individuals, our species has come terrifyingly close to extinction multiple times. We're not invulnerable. We're not immune to the forces that shape all life on Earth. Climate change can push us to the brink. Volcanic eruptions can disrupt our societies. Environmental degradation can threaten our survival. The ancient bottleneck occurred because of climate changes that our ancestors had no ability to predict, prevent, or control. They survived through adaptation and luck, through being in the right places with the right skills at the right time. The more recent bottlenecks occurred for similar reasons. Environmental changes beyond human influence creating conditions that pushed populations to the edge. Today, we face environmental challenges of our own making. Human-caused climate change is altering global temperatures and precipitation patterns. Habitat destruction is driving other species to extinction at rates not seen since the last mass extinction event. Ocean acidification, desertification, and ecosystem collapse threaten the environmental systems that support human civilization. We have become a geological force capable of changing the planet in ways that rival natural processes. But we also have capabilities our ancient ancestors lacked. We can predict climate change. We can model its effects. We can, if we choose, take actions to mitigate the worst impacts. We have the knowledge and the tools to avoid pushing ourselves into another bottleneck, to prevent the kind of population crash that nearly ended our species in the past. The question is whether we have the wisdom and the will to use those capabilities. The story of the bottlenecks reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, that species can be pushed to the edge more easily than we might think. But it also reminds us of human resilience, of our capacity to adapt and persist even under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Our ancestors survived for 117,000 years in a population small enough to fit in a modern concert venue. They maintained their humanity, their cultures, their technologies through millennia of hardship. They didn't just survive, they eventually thrived, expanding to become the most widespread large mammal on Earth. That same resilience, that same adaptability, lives on in us. But resilience has limits. There are points of no return, thresholds beyond which recovery becomes impossible. The loss of 66% of genetic diversity during the ancient bottleneck was catastrophic, but the species survived. A loss of 99% would likely have been fatal. Every species has a minimum viable population, a point below which the extinction vortex becomes inescapable. Our ancestors came dangerously close to that point. The bottlenecks also raise questions about what was lost. When 66% of genetic diversity disappeared, what potential went with it? What genetic variations that might have been useful in different circumstances simply vanished? What capabilities, what resistances to diseases, what physical or mental traits were among the variants that didn't make it through the bottleneck? We can never know what was lost. The genetic variation that disappeared is gone forever, erased from the human lineage as thoroughly as if it had never existed. We can only work with what remains, the genetic legacy of those 1,280 breeding individuals who survived when so many others did not. Yet, despite this loss, despite multiple brushes with extinction, despite the vulnerability inherent in our evolutionary history, humans have proven to be one of the most successful species on the planet. From that tiny bottleneck population, we have expanded to over 8 billion individuals. We have colonized every continent, adapted to every major biome, developed technologies that allow us to survive in environments from deep underwater to the vacuum of space. This success is built on the same characteristics that allowed our ancestors to survive the bottlenecks: behavioral flexibility, cultural transmission of knowledge, capacity for cooperation, ability to innovate and adapt. These traits, refined in the crucible of near extinction, have carried us from the edge of oblivion to global dominance. The story written in our DNA is ultimately one of survival and persistence. It's a story of populations reduced to a few thousand individuals who somehow found a way to endure. It's a story of genetic diversity lost, but resilience maintained. It's a story of climate catastrophes weathered, of volcanic winters survived, of challenges met and overcome. And it's a story that continues. The bottlenecks are part of our past, but the challenges they represent, environmental changes, resource scarcity, climate shifts, remain relevant to our future. Understanding our evolutionary history, understanding how close we've come to extinction, and what allowed us to survive, provides crucial context for the challenges we face today. We are the descendants of survivors, carriers of a genetic heritage shaped by the most extreme selective pressures. That heritage includes both strengths and vulnerabilities, capabilities and limitations. Knowing this history, understanding where we came from and what we've endured, can help us navigate the uncertain future ahead. Closing. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through deep time, back to the present, back to this moment where you lie comfortable and warm, thinking about ancestors who faced the unimaginable. Those early humans, reduced to a handful of individuals scattered across a harsh landscape, somehow found within themselves the strength to persist. Generation after generation, they raised children, passed on knowledge, adapted to circumstances that would have destroyed species less flexible, less resilient, less determined to survive. They couldn't have known that their struggle would matter, that they were preserving not just their own lives, but the entire future of human civilization. They couldn't have imagined cities of millions, technologies that would seem like magic, a species that would one day walk on the moon and send machines to explore other planets. They were simply surviving, day by day, doing what needed to be done to see another sunrise. Yet, their survival made all the difference. Every achievement of human civilization, every work of art and science, every moment of joy and connection between people traces its lineage back through those bottlenecks, back through those survivors who refused to let the human story end. They are our ancestors, and we are their legacy. As you drift toward sleep now, you carry within your cells the same chromosome fusion, the same genetic markers of survival. You are part of an unbroken chain stretching back nearly 1 million years through the bottleneck and beyond. Whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you carry within you the heritage of species that has survived the impossible before. Let that thought comfort you as you settle deeper into rest. The story of humanity is a story of survival, of persistence against overwhelming odds. And you are part of that story, a living continuation of a lineage that refused to end. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within you the strength of ancestors who survived when the world itself seemed bent on their destruction. And if you've enjoyed this journey through time, if these stories of deep history and ancient survival have brought you some measure of peace or wonder, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the Long Winter Archive for more explorations of history and science. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to you, to explore the past and understand how it shapes our present and future. Rest now. The story of humanity continues, and tomorrow is another chapter in that ongoing tale. Good night.